Act 1, the program. Before we name the journalists, we have to name the machine that recruited them. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. In 1947, the United States stood at the edge of a new kind of war, not fought with armies on a map, fought with headlines, radio voices, and the stories Americans trusted before breakfast. The OSS had just dissolved. The CIA was being born, and inside both institutions, a small group of men already understood that the next battlefield would be the front page. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. Frank Wisner built the Office of Policy Coordination inside the CIA. His job was not to win battles overseas. It was to win the argument before the public ever knew there was one. Wisner mapped influence the way generals map terrain. Who could be approached? Who could be briefed? Who would take a phone call after midnight and never ask why? The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. When the Central Intelligence Agency was formally established in 1947, Wisner's shop inherited a simple premise: control the story and you control the room. The founding documents talked about national security in abstract language. The operational files talked about editors, publishers, and columnists in concrete ones. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. The files were never meant to sit on open shelves. Manila folders, typed memos, routing slips stamped secret, each one a receipt for something the press was never supposed to print. Researchers would spend decades chasing those folders through FOIA delays and partial declassification, because Mockingbird was designed to leave paper. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. Mockingbird was not one memo with a signature at the bottom. It was a corridor of programs, propaganda, placement, pressure, all pointing the same direction. Some operations had code names. Some never had names at all. What they shared was a theory of American democracy, that citizens could be managed if the right stories arrived in the right order. The early files are the clearest one, before the language turned euphemistic. Historians would later argue about names and numbers, but the pattern was visible early. Intelligence officers treating newsrooms the way generals treated supply lines. You do not need to own every outlet. You need to know which 3 phone calls still move the narrative on a slow news day, and who picks up when Langley rings. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. Inside Langley, media influence was bureaucracy. Budget lines, contact lists, asset reports filed the same way a case officer files a dead drop. The language in those reports is cold on purpose. Editors become contacts. Contacts become access. Access becomes the ability to place a paragraph that reads like news and functions like policy. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. By the early 50s, the Cold War was a daily front page. Every editorial choice, what to amplify, what to bury, became a strategic decision, whether they admitted it or not. A single headline could validate a covert program overseas or destroy a domestic critic. Mockingbird lived in that margin between journalism and statecraft. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. Wisner called it a mighty Wurlitzer. One keyboard, many outlets. The CIA did not need to own every newspaper. It only needed to know which levers still moved. Funding could flow through foundations. Stories could arrive through friendly correspondence. Denials could be pre-written before the question was even asked in public. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. On paper, it looked like a network diagram. Funds to front groups to editors, editors to readers. The American press reimagined as a relay station. That diagram is the part Mockingbird deniers hate most, because it turns a romantic institution into infrastructure. And infrastructure can be maintained. The early files are the clearest, before the language turned euphemistic. Act 2, the network. If Act 1 was the blueprint, Act 2 is the wiring. Who got connected and what it cost to stay connected. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Some recruits looked like journalists, some looked like professors. The Church Committee would later document CIA relationships with media figures who moved between both worlds without announcing the handoff. A byline in the morning, a briefing in the afternoon. The public saw the article. It did not see the routing slip. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Major newsrooms in New York and Washington were not monoliths. They were desks, rivalries, and deadlines, which made them perfect targets for a patient agency with a long memory. Mockingbird did not require every reporter to be complicit. It required enough pressure points that the institution bent without looking like it bent at all. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Television changed the tempo. A 30-second segment could reach millions. Mockingbird-era programs expanded from print into broadcast just as the living room became the battlefield. The visual language of trust, anchors, sets, ticker tape became another surface the agency could learn to play. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Internal lists circulated: who could be approached, who could be briefed off the record, who would take a check and call it expenses. Those lists are the moral center of the scandal, not because every name on them committed a crime, but because the list itself proves the scale of the attempt. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. The mechanism was often mundane: a lunch, a tip, a planted story rewritten just enough to survive an editor's pencil, influence wearing the costume of routine journalism. That is why Mockingbird is hard to prosecute in the court of public opinion. The crime looks like a normal Tuesday in a newsroom. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. When journalists died young or careers collapsed overnight, researchers drew strings on corkboards trying to separate coincidence from consequence. Mockingbird sits in that uncomfortable gray. Not every string leads back to Langley, but enough strings do that the board keeps getting rebuilt every decade. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Off the record meant off the record, unless you were the agency keeping the transcript. Interviews became intelligence products wrapped in courtesy. A source speaks freely because they trust the reporter. The reporter speaks carefully because someone else may be reading the notes later in a room with no cameras. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Wire services amplified everything downstream. Control the wire, and a single paragraph could become 1,000 local headlines by morning. Mockingbird understood distribution physics better than most publishers did because the agency's product was never ink. It was reach. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Layout editors decided what sat above the fold. Placement is power. Mockingbird understood that power was often exercised in inches, not oratories. A story moved from page 12 to page 1 is a story reclassified as reality, even when the underlying facts never changed. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. The scale is the part that still shocks. Investigators and journalists would claim hundreds of media relationships, not one rogue reporter, but a system. When you see multiple silhouettes in the same frame, that is the visual argument. Mockingbird was industrial, not individual. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. 400 journalists. That number comes from Carl Bernstein's 1977 Rolling Stone investigation. Disputed, partially confirmed, never fully put to rest. It remains the headline Mockingbird cannot escape. Whether the exact count holds or not, the direction of the evidence is consistent. This was not a hobby. The network only worked because each node could plausibly deny the whole. Act 3, Declassified. The program did not end because someone felt guilty. It had ended because the country started reading its own files. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. The 1970s broke the seal. Watergate cracked public trust. The Church Committee pulled intelligence programs into fluorescent hearing rooms and made senators read the parts agencies hoped would stay classified. Mockingbird was not always named cleanly in open testimony, but media manipulation was. The language shifted from denial to managed admission. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Committee staff stacked binders high enough to hide a witness. Mockingbird was not always named cleanly in the open testimony, but media manipulation was. The files show a government that treated the First Amendment as a variable to solve for, not a boundary to respect. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Leaks did not end with typewriters. Each new format, cable, digital, social, reopened the same question. Who sets the frame when the frame is the product? A PDF on a laptop is still a manila folder. A thread is still a front page. The Wurlitzer learned new instruments. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Washington runs on information advantage. The steps outside those hearing rooms are where public language gets sanitized and the raw language stays in the vault. Senators leave the camera and return to language that can be quoted. Staffers leave with language that cannot. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Mockingbird was American in origin, but the logic was global. Influence operations do not respect borders. When the audience is everywhere, the signal reaches. The map on the wall is a reminder. Once you treat information as a weapon, every country with a printing press becomes terrain. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Today's newsrooms glow at midnight with different tools. Same tension, sources, subsidies, silence. The Wurlitzer did not disappear. It learned new instruments. Algorithmic feeds replaced wire services. Influencers replaced columnists. The architecture changed. The incentive did not. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Declassification is slow because embarrassment is durable. Boxes leave the vault redacted line by redacted line. A drip feed of confirmations dressed as footnotes. Mockingbird teaches you to read what is missing as carefully as what remains. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Every confidential stamp is a small admission. Someone knew this document could damage trust if it landed on the wrong desk. Mockingbird was built on that calculation, that the Republic could absorb a managed story more easily than an unmanaged fact. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. One page, one redacted paragraph. That is often all the public gets. Enough to know the program was real, never enough to map the whole machine. That gap is not an accident. It is the final product. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. We open on a folder that should not exist in daylight. We close with the same desk because the story was never about a single operation. It was about who gets to write the first draft of history. The folder now reads Declassified. The habit does not. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology. Operation Mockingbird is the case file. The pattern is the warning. If you want the next declassified operation, Berlin Tunnel, MK Ultra, or the program you think still has not surfaced, subscribe and tell us which file to open next in the comments. What survived declassification is the architecture, not the apology.